most famously when he was testing out a microphone and said, "We begin bombing Russia in 5 minutes." Um, that didn't help him any.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But most people at least understood that that was not serious.
Yeah, that's
One of the
fun.
things about Trump's style is you can't always tell whether he's being serious or not.
Dr. Zarevsky, it's a pleasure to have you on our program. Thank you for taking the time for this conversation with me. So, I got to ask you this. What did you think of Mr. Trump's second inauguration? Kind of like the event.
Well, the event as a whole was particularly unusual because it was moved inside. Only the second or third time that's happened.
Yeah, yeah.
And that affected the setting of the speech, the cadence of the speech, even the echo of his voice off the floor.
Oh,
Um,
okay.
but the content of the speech was equally unusual. We can get into that in more detail.
Of
In
course.
some respects, it violates the norms of an inaugural address, and in other respects, it carries them out and tries to reconcile the two.
Oh, wow. Interesting. Before we go on to his speech and speaking style, which is really the purpose of this conversation, my interview with you, um, is there anything you want to share with the audience about like how this inauguration? I get the outdoors sort of anomaly and the indoors anomaly, but any takeaways, any comparisons of this inauguration to any other inaugurations in your own lifetime?
Well, it's much more different from any inaugurations
Yeah,
in my lifetime,
yeah,
and for
yeah.
that matter, in earlier times. Um, but I guess the similarities would be when Mr. Trump reaches for an overarching principle like the golden age of America,
I noted that.
or
Yeah,
that he's going to be a unifier and a peacemaker. You can find echoes of those themes in earlier inaugurals,
yeah.
both contemporary and more historical.
Um, we're now talking about his speech, and before we get too far into that, can you explain the term rhetoric to me? What does that mean? And you're a scholar of rhetoric. When in common parlance, you hear, people say, "Don't give me a bunch of rhetoric," or "That was just a rhetorical statement." So,
Yeah, in ordinary usage, it refers either to empty language or to flowery and ornate language, and obviously neither of
exactly.
those is what I study.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But for 2,500 years, there's been a dispute going on between advocates of philosophy searching for truth and advocates of rhetoric searching for probabilities. And there's an ongoing argument about what rhetoric is. But I think the most simple and neutral way to define it is the art of persuasion.
Oh, hence the 2,500 year squabble argument between people that advocate philosophy, others rhetoric, because philosophy goes to the truth, rhetoric is more for persuasion.
Well, rhetoric is based upon the assumption that there are categories of things that we can't know the truth. And so we have to judge based on probabilities and appearances.
I see. Probabilities and appearances.
And of course,
Um,
advocates of philosophy would say that's a bankrupt approach. Advocates of rhetoric would say that's all we have. And it goes back to the dispute between Plato and Isocrates that Aristotle tried to resolve.
um,
So you've opened up a big can of worms that we could talk about at great length, but that's another time.
that's another podcast. And it's so funny. I mean, you're talking about the difference between philosophy and rhetoric and the dispute between the two, and it almost goes to politics. Um, um,
One of the things that Aristotle wrote was that rhetoric was closely related to politics and ethics.
there you go. Wow. Um, I want to ask another question about your research focus because I think it's relevant to our conversation, just like my question about rhetoric. Um, when I was reading about your background and your bio, uh, It states that you teach courses in history and criticism of US public discourse. What does that mean, US public discourse?
Well, the key term is public,
Yeah.
and public refers to things that are concerned with people generally rather than in their specialized capacity, in their capacity as citizens rather than professionals of one kind or another. Discourse, of course, refers to any kind of interaction between people. And of course, in the modern day, discourse has expanded considerably to embrace new technologies, new means of communication, a broader conception of audience. But ironically, what I tend to be most concerned about is in my own research is the most traditional understanding of discourse, which is oral and written
Oral and
exchange.
written. I
So
see.
I study formal speeches, even though formal speeches play less and less of a role in our public communications.
Yeah. Um, this raises an interesting question. Has your focus, or perhaps even the definition of the term public discourse, changed in the last 30, 40 years? And the reason I ask this is because going back sometimes several decades, what became public were statements or speeches or conversations by celebrities, by politicians, by powerful business people, by people that had the megaphone to make what they say public, that important word within the phrase U.S. Public discourse. But now anyone can have a public statement made, and then people will respond to it, and all of a sudden that becomes discourse on social media. So has that concept changed?
Well, there are really two parts to your question. One is, has the concept of public discourse changed? Absolutely. The
Huh.
other is, has my research focus changed? Not very much, because I
Yeah,
tend to work not with discourse of the moment, but with discourse that's older. The
I see.
periods on which I focus are the pre-Civil War period, for example, and the 1950s and 1960s when we were beginning to expand the concept of public discourse.
Mhm.
I have not myself taken up to study the tremendous changes that have taken place in the last 30 or 40 years. I'm
Yeah,
certainly aware of them. And
yeah,
as a result, some of the conclusions I reach can't be generalized to the more recent period, but others can.
yeah. We'll be back after a short break to talk about President Trump's speech making and speaking style and get into history by comparing it to other presidents. We'll be right back. Dr. Zarefsky, what did you think of Mr. Trump's inauguration speech?
There's a tension in the speech.
Tension. Okay.
There's a tension between something that very few other, if any, other inaugurals have done, which is to lay out a detailed set of policy plans that he's going to implement. It's much more common for the inaugural to focus on broad principles of a unifying nature rather than specific policies of a divisive nature. That's in tension with his claim to be a peacemaker and a unifier, which is consistent with the general role of the inaugural address to transcend the divisiveness of the recent campaign, something that goes all the way back to Thomas Jefferson. The way that I think Trump tries to resolve that tension is by using his election as proof that the whole country has changed in his direction and is waiting for him to lead, which is somewhat at variance with the facts of the election. Although it is
Yeah.
true that he won all 7 of the swing states and that he carried the House and the Senate by very small majorities. But he did not win a landslide. He did not get 50% of the popular vote. He did not win a landslide in the Electoral College. He got one more state than he got the previous time that he was elected. And it was one of about the 10 closest Electoral College elections. But instead of
One of
that
the 10
narrative,
closest electoral college?
yes,
Oh, wow. Okay.
I believe that's correct.
Okay.
But he used a different narrative from that. He used the narrative of the whole country changing, and not only that, of God anointing him for the purpose of making America great again. So, in his own person, he fuses the specific policies that he's going to put in place and the broader themes, but the broader themes get much less attention. So that would be my overall take on the speech.
So that's a very interesting thing to see that you uh, explained that there is a tension, but he attempts to resolve it by saying that there's actually no tension because the whole country has come along with me, has voted for
Right,
me. That's
right.
the setup. Um, is this tension I, that unusual? It seems like it is based on what you said. Is
Well,
it
it's unusual in the emphasis that he gives to the specifics. I mean, some
okay?
of the quick commentaries on the speech have said it's more like a State of the Union speech, and
Hmm.
it is in some respects that it has a laundry list of proposals. They're proposals that he's advanced in the campaign, and his claim that the whole country voted for him gives legitimacy to the proposals and allows him to make them as assertions of what will in fact happen in the coming years.
I see. Um, are there other presidents that we should compare his inauguration speech to?
Well, before we do that, we should remind ourselves of one basic fact.
Which
There's
is,
no constitutional requirement to have an inaugural address.
oh,
There's nothing in the Constitution that
yeah,
says the president has to do it.
exactly. Okay.
So the first question is, well, why does an inaugural address get started in the first place? And it's a decision that George Washington made, that what he needed to do was to solidify public understanding of what the presidency was for. And Washington's first inaugural is very much about the importance of public virtue, a preference for the public good over private interest. And he needs to establish that that's what he's going to represent. And he makes much of the fact that he didn't campaign for the office, he didn't seek it in any way. He was called, as he says in the speech, by providence. Now, he doesn't mean by
Hmm.
that exactly the same thing that Trump does when Trump says, God picked me for this purpose. Washington locates providence in the people. And it's the people's exercise of providential
Oh,
judgment to place virtue as the highest value in the presidency. And he wants to explain that and defend that to the members of Congress who are his immediate audience. Washington's second inaugural is much different. It's the
hmm.
shortest of all the inaugurals. It's only about 135 words long. And in the
Oh,
second
wow.
inaugural, what Washington does is he says, in effect, look, I'm here before Congress to swear this oath. You are my witnesses. And if I violate my oath, you will be justified not only in enacting the constitutional punishment of impeachment, but of censuring me in your own hearts and consciences. And that's all he says. John Adams gives an inaugural that is largely an homage to Washington and the founders in general. The first inaugural that resembles the ones today is Thomas Jefferson's first inaugural.
Okay.
And Jefferson,
So we're talking 1801.
1801.
Okay.
Jefferson, as you know, is speaking against the backdrop not only of a contested election,
Yeah,
but
yeah,
of a
yeah.
viciously contested election. He wasn't chosen as president until February 15th or 16th in the House of Representatives on the 36th ballot.
And inauguration was
President.
on March 4th, so like 2 weeks
And
before
2 weeks,
inauguration. Yeah.
2 weeks, he has to modify public opinion. So he uses the inaugural address to try to overcome the divisiveness of the election. He says, not every difference of opinion is a difference of principle. We are all Federalists. We are all Republicans, and tries to appeal to a concept of national unity. He emphasizes he emphasizes the broad principles that his administration will try to follow, and he probably focuses on the broad principles because they're easier to get agreement. And then he emphasizes his own humility and limitations as he enters the office of president and asks for not only the support of the people, but he prays that he may find God's favor.
Um, Not to get into politics of the moment, but that is very different than Mr. Trump's speech.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Okay.
Now, Jefferson's first inaugural set the standard for inaugural addresses. Not every election.
Second inaugural, 1805. Okay.
No, his first inaugural.
Oh, his first inaugural.
His
Okay.
first inaugural set the standard for most of the subsequent inaugural addresses,
And,
particularly the ones that we remember as especially famous, but we can get into that later on. Now, to your question, Mr. Trump's inaugural is very different from those in a number of respects.
okay.
It's, as I said before, you can find some similarities, but the differences far outweigh them. There's a note of self-confidence, even some would say arrogance, in Trump's inaugural that contrasts with the note of humility in Jefferson's and in many of the other inaugurals. There's a determination about what actions will be taken and how quickly they will be taken and what results they will have. There is no note of humility at all in the speech that I could find, nor is humility one of Trump's strong suits as a matter of speaking style and writing style more generally. It's replaced with this note of self-confidence. There are references to the election, far more references than there were in Jefferson's. Jefferson referred vaguely to the recent contest in which we have been engaged. Trump refers to the results of the election and attributes meaning to the results of the election, which, as I said a minute ago, he portrays as more decisive than in fact they were, although they were in many respects decisive. So that's how the Trump inaugural is particularly different, and it's hard for me to even find a parallel case to talk about.
Oh, wow.
I looked up in getting ready for this chat.
Uh-huh.
I looked up Grover Cleveland's second inaugural.
Yeah, that would be the other non-consecutive U.S.
The
president.
only other non-consecutive
Yeah.
person, the only other person serving two non-consecutive terms.
And I think his second one, correct me if I think it's 1893 or thereabouts. Okay, there you go.
1893.
Yes,
And
sir.
like Trump, he defeated the person who had defeated him
Yeah.
4 years before. Well, Trump
Harrison.
didn't literally do that because he lost to Biden and then defeated Harris.
Yeah.
Cleveland lost to Benjamin Harrison and then defeated Benjamin Harrison.
Yeah.
In Cleveland's second inaugural, there's no reference to the fact that it is a second inaugural.
Huh.
There's a brief reference in Trump's case when he says, "my return to the presidency." That's the only reference he makes to the fact that it's a second inaugural. Cleveland gives a very different second inaugural from his first inaugural because he acknowledges how the country has changed. He talks about the Depression. He talks about the need to lower the tariff, ironically.
Yeah.
He talks about the temptations of international aggrandizement. these are not elements of his first inaugural. Trump, although he's much more specific in his second inaugural, it follows in many ways the course of the first inaugural. We have no reference to American carnage in the second inaugural, but we
Uh,
have the same dark spirit of foreboding and emphasis on the radical nature of the change that his administration will be making. It's interesting in the second inaugural, the one the other day, he refers back uh, to some of the same conditions that he described in the first inaugural. But in the second inaugural, he says, for long periods of time, such and such and such has been the case, and now we're going to turn it around.
yeah.
And of course, the long periods of time include his own first term, which he never acknowledges.
Yeah. What he may have wanted to say is for long periods of time, with the exception of the 4 years during my first administration.
Right.
Yeah.
But he
And,
didn't say that.
and for our audience, I just want to remind our audience, you are analyzing his speech. We could have a political conversation, but this is not that. We're talking specifically about his speaking style and his speech.
Correct.
Yeah. Before we go on to any other presidents, if you wish to do that, I just have a question for you, Dr. Zarefsky. We spent some time on Thomas Jefferson. Was he a good orator? Was he a good speaker? Like,
Absolutely not. Jefferson had probably the most pronounced case of speech anxiety of any of the presidents.
Jefferson? Like,
Jefferson.
wow.
And the proof of that is Jefferson converted the State of the Union address from an address to a written message that was sent to Congress. And that was followed by all subsequent presidents until Woodrow Wilson. Wilson reestablished the tradition of the State of the Union address as the president going to Congress and delivering the address as a speech.
Wow, what
And
you mean? So
Wilson,
from the first decade of the 19th century until the second decade of the 20th century, we didn't have the traditional speech of the State of the Union?
right. And in fact,
Wow.
if you go back and read some of the older State of the Union messages, they're deadly dull. They reviewed department by department revenues and expenditures and major activities. And they were these long documents that were sent by the president to Congress and read by a clerk. And I doubt if anybody listened.
It
And
was
it was
more like a
Wilson,
report.
right?
Yeah,
It was
yeah.
Wilson who reestablished the oral tradition of the State of the Union address.
Do you think part of that is because there were microphones and there was recording and he wanted to capitalize on that? I don't think the radio was common in his presidency. It comes on in the
Correct.
1920s. Do you
Correct. It had
think?
been invented, but it was not common.
Yeah. So do you think the fact that there were recording devices and all of that, that's the reason why he wanted to do it, or no?
No, I think he believed in the power of oratory.
Was he good at it?
He was quite good at it.
Wilson. Wow. Okay. Good orator. Are there any other presidents that you wish to their inaugural speech or any other speeches that you like to talk about?
Well, my favorite of all the inaugural addresses is Lincoln's second.
Lincoln's second. Okay.
Lincoln's second, which was about the shortest one that's been delivered except for Washington's second. But it
Why
was
is
Lincoln's second inaugural that
Mhm.
ended with the phrase, with malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we're in.
Yeah.
And there's so many things about the construction of that inaugural that are so interesting to me. So, for example, it talks about the cause of the war. He doesn't say that slavery was the cause of the war. He says the interest constituted by slavery was somehow the cause of the war. And
That's different than saying slavery, right?
exactly.
The interest constituted by slavery.
That's right.
Huh.
He said these slave he said 1/8 of the uh, population were colored slaves concentrated in the southern part of the Union, not evenly divided across it. Well, first of all, he refers to the South as the southern part of the Union, which the Southerners were not yet prepared to accept.
Yeah,
They
yeah,
saw
yeah, yeah.
themselves as an independent nation.
Yeah.
He said, these slaves constituted a peculiar and powerful interest. All understood that this interest was somehow the cause of the war. So that gets him into the economics of slavery rather
Yeah,
than
yeah,
the
yeah.
morality of slavery. And it enables him to indict the North as well as the South. But then there are other parts in the speech where he seems to blame the South, where he says, he said, both pray to the same God. And he adds, it may seem strange for anyone to appeal to a just God for help in subduing other men. I'm
Yeah.
getting off of the exact language.
Yeah, yeah.
But let us judge not that we be not judged. So he balances equal blame and unequal blame, and so on. He's ambiguous about what finishing up the work we're in means. He doesn't in this speech talk about the progress of the war. It doesn't celebrate the coming Union victory, even though a Union victory is by this point pretty much assured. And in fact, Lee surrendered a month later
Yeah, so this is March 4th,
in
1865,
65.
and then the Civil War ends. Yeah, 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 a month later. Um, so he
But
does.
you can get me on Lincoln for a long time.
So tell me why it is that you particularly like this speech. Is it because it's unifying? There are parts of it that he seems to take jabs, or that's wrong, to point to the South as having that sort of blaming them. Uh,
I like this speech because it's so layered. It does so much in such a little span of words. It's only 700 words long. And
does
you can see so much in it as a speech.
does does being layered also mean that it's vague, or it has different ways of interpreting it?
It's it's polymorphous, if you will. It has different ways of
Morphosis.
interpreting it,
Yeah,
but they're not vague.
I see. That's different.
So you can read it this way or you can read it this way, but they're both quite clear.
But is that a good thing? Isn't it better for a president to have a sort of speech that you can only read it one way?
That depends what the president wants to achieve.
That's true.
I mean, typically a president's got to meld together coalitions that may have different views or different priorities. Uh, I mean, Trump, in fact, is trying to do that with his emphasis on making America great again.
Yeah,
The only dispute that we can have about that is whether it's already great to start with.
yeah, yeah,
But you could read making America great again as doing this or doing this or doing this. You could read it as attracting more immigrants or repelling more immigrants.
yeah,
Each one you could construct an argument that would make America great again.
yeah. Even Democrats could pick up that slogan, "Make America." Who can argue with that, right?
Sure,
Yeah.
sure.
Um, I want to ask this point uh, where Adams. I'm kind of going back. Where
Okay.
Adams and Washington good speakers?
There's not much evidence one way or another. I mean,
Hmm,
I'm sure they were decent speakers. Neither one had his reputation primarily as an orator.
I see. I see. It, of all the presidents we've had, which one do you think was the best orator, most effective speaker?
Well, this is not a carefully considered judgment. I may be leaving somebody out, but
Oh, that's okay.
my my initial reaction would be to say Franklin Roosevelt.
Oh, FDR. Okay. I I've actually listened and watched several of his speeches. I agree with that definitely. What about Reagan?
Reagan would come close and Kennedy would come close.
Reagan and JFK. Dr. Zarifsky, we are talking about oratory skills. We're talking about speeches. Um, you and I, before the podcast, we were communicating about Mr. Trump's sort of comments and speech, I guess you could call it, in Emancipation Hall after the inaugural speech. But that's not really a speech. That's just, he's just speaking. That's a speaking style. So let's talk about that. What did you think of this?
Why is it not a speech?
I don't know. To me, I'm not an
It
expert. Speech is something that is carefully constructed and aides pour over it and write it up and you read off a teleprompter or a piece of paper, right?
Well, that's one kind of a speech.
Uh-huh.
But remarks at a press conference are also a speech. Extemporaneous speaking is also a kind of speech. Ad lib is a kind of speech.
Okay. Yeah, I agree. I see your point.
But I interrupted you, I think.
Yeah, no, no. What I'm trying to get to is presidential speaking styles,
Okay.
which is in my mind different than speech making.
Okay.
Um,
Most presidents speak formally. In fact, I'll tell you another Lincoln story.
hmm,
Lincoln made only 95, I think it was, speeches the entire time he was in office. And most of those were welcoming speeches to visiting delegations.
hmm,
Lincoln was asked why didn't he give more speeches because he had been so effective before he was president as a speaker on the stump, talking extemporaneously,
yeah.
uh, off the cuff. And he said he couldn't afford to do that as president because everything the president says is taken so seriously.
Wow, what a good
And
point. Yeah,
he got that right. So when
yeah,
you talk about presidential speaking styles, you are talking for the most part about formal addresses that are delivered from manuscript. Never mind for a minute how the manuscript gets prepared or by whom,
yeah,
but they're
yeah,
delivered from manuscript, and today they're delivered from reading a teleprompter.
yeah,
That
yeah.
that's absolutely right as a characterization of presidential address. So when the president speaks ad lib or informally or extemporaneously or makes a Freudian slip or says a joke that people don't understand to be a joke, every one of those things has immense consequences because it's the president.
Yeah, yeah.
Now, Trump is given much more to extemporaneous speaking than most presidents have been, and it sometimes gets him into trouble. And he sometimes says later he was only kidding. And then people argue about was he really kidding or not. So that's a feature of Trump's speech, and it came out in the remarks in Emancipation Hall. And as an extemporaneous speaker, you could say he's more likely to reveal his true feelings
Hmm.
than as a formal, polished manuscript speaker. Of course, the danger in that is in revealing his personal true feelings. He may make statements that are not diplomatic or not in the interest of the United States or not consistent with his public policy position.
Yeah. Have we had other presidents that have made so many sort of free, off the cuff remarks?
Reagan did it a lot. And
Did
in
he get in
fact,
trouble?
occasionally, I
Hmm.
mean, most famously when he was testing out a microphone and said, "We begin bombing Russia in 5 minutes," uh, that didn't help him any.
Yeah, 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 yeah,
But most people at least understood that that was not serious.
yeah. That's
One of the
true.
things about Trump's style is you can't always tell whether he's being serious or not.
Yeah. Do you think Mr. Trump's style will set a trend for subsequent presidents? You know how you said Thomas Jefferson set the inauguration trend for other presidents.
I think what's likeliest to set a trend is the specificity of the content rather than the
I see.
uh, tendency to ad lib. The specificity of the content of the inaugural. I think
In,
some other presidents will ad lib, some won't, as it befits their own persona and their own comfort level with public speaking.
Interesting. You,
Kennedy also frequently changed the manuscript of his speeches. And most famously with Kennedy, his civil rights speech from 1963, following the integration of the University of Alabama, his speechwriters couldn't get the speech finished in time. So only about the first half of the speech had a manuscript, and about the last half of the speech he delivered ad lib,
was it a
and was
good
very.
speech?
It was a very good speech.
Oh, wow.
It's a speech that's still remembered as a turning point in presidential involvement in civil rights. That was the speech in which he said we're confronted primarily with a moral issue. It's as old as the scriptures and as clear as the American Constitution. I forget exactly where it was in the speech where the manuscript ended.
Wow, that's a testament to his speaking and communication style.
If you want an even better example, although it's not a presidential one, Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech.
Uh-huh.
About the last half of that speech was delivered impromptu.
Oh, really?
Yes,
Oh, wow. Well, he gave a lot of sermons and he talked.
yes,
Yes, he was. Yeah.
yes. And he
Um,
reached back to some of his older sermons, but there was no manuscript.
Dr. Zarefsky, what makes for an effective communicator as a president? You're telling me how you liked JFK's speech and MLK's.
Well, there's not an easy answer to that question.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the presidential speeches that are most remembered are ones that did two things.
Mm-hmm.
First, they spoke directly to the issue of the moment. And second, they transcended the moment.
Oh, that's wonderful. Yeah. They
But the way
spoke.
you do that is different depending upon the circumstances.
Yeah. 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 First, directly deal with the issue and then go above and beyond that, say how we can overcome it or transcend the moment. That's very interesting. Let's take a break here. We'll return shortly to talk about how presidential rhetoric affects our society, the way we talk and the way we interact. We'll be right back. Dr. Zarefsky, you already touched on this in our last segment. I'd like to continue it. And my question is this: do the way our presidents communicate impact the way we communicate?
Well, sometimes, I mean, there's some presidents that people enjoy imitating. Uh,
Imitating.
for caricature,
Like Saturday Night Live and everything like that.
right?
Yeah, yeah.
Uh, there's that whole genre that I think probably started with Kennedy, but has characterized most of the recent presidents. And it's a, it's a sort of debunking of the exalted nature of the presidency. But in a more serious vein, uh, there are aspects of presidential communication that do ripple out.
Mm-hmm.
For example, a president who says you're either with us or against us, as George W. Bush did at the uh, in the aftermath of 9/11.
Yeah, in the
That
State of the Union address. Yeah.
right, that kind of either or thinking, or the presidential metaphor that he used of the axis of evil, talking about Iran, Iraq, and North Korea.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Uh, those are rhetorical choices that the president makes about how to communicate, but they ripple out and get picked up in public discourse more generally.
Hmm?
Uh, but that doesn't happen all the time, or it doesn't happen with great predictability. What catches on and affects popular communication more generally. But the president is uniquely positioned to do that because of the power that he occupies. And a
Yeah,
large part of that power is deployed through presidential rhetoric.
yeah,
That's something we've come to realize much more in recent years.
yeah, yeah. Um, I just asked you about whether or not the way president communicates impacts the way we communicate. Let me ask a similar but different question. Does the way a president speak, whether that's just ad lib or formal speech, does that impact our values, our behavior? Do we have a history on that?
Well, I mean, not so much directly. It affects our values as we pick up presidential idioms or phrases or expressions of priority. So, for example, I don't think anything that Trump says about tariffs is going to change our values about tariffs or about economic independence or
Yeah.
about our relationship to other nations. It's going to be a contested and controversial concept as it's been so far. When the president says a golden age begins today, there is the possibility that that will serve to inspire national optimism in a way that had not existed before. I don't know that it will lead to a great public movement to buy Greenland or invade Panama or any of those specifics of imperialism,
Yeah.
which the president actually used the term manifest destiny in the inaugural address.
Yeah.
Uh,
Which
and
is
in
interesting
his,
because President Polk used manifest destiny to go to war with Mexico and add so much land to our
yes,
country. Yeah.
yes.
Wow.
And McKinley, to whom Trump paid homage, McKinley did not so much talk that way as claim that he found himself in a position where he had no alternative but to take the Philippines and Cuba and the other products of the Spanish-American War. You don't find that in his inaugural address. I went back and looked at McKinley's inaugural to see if Trump was picking from that, and that's not there.
Oh, interesting. Even though
Prime,
McKinley and this is the era of Rough Riders and Teddy Roosevelt
right?
went to the Spanish American War. He didn't do it with bravado. McKinley's position was that he had to go through
Yes,
this,
yes,
which is sort of, but it's interesting. So Mr. Trump chooses words such as manifest destiny and makes reference to President McKinley, and he has his own sort of plans, Canada, Panama, Greenland, and all of that.
yes. Now, the place where Trump and McKinley were aligned
Uh-huh.
is in the praise of business and the use of the tariff. McKinley favored very high tariffs. He
Hmm.
reversed Cleveland's lowering of the tariff.
I see. Um, if you wanted our audience to remember just one point about presidential rhetoric, what would that be?
That it's a form of action, that there's not a distinction between words and actions when it comes to the president. Words are a kind of action, and that's the power of presidential rhetoric. There's a book that's titled Deeds Done in Words to describe presidential communication and how influential it is. So that when the president speaks, he or she is doing something by the act of speaking, creating a sense of reality. So that would be the thing I would want to leave is the notion that presidential rhetoric is a powerful form of action.
Yeah, that's a wonderful point. Dr. Zorefsky, thank you so much for educating me and our audience. And to our audience, if you know of any history that could provide more perspective from the past on this subject, please share it with us and tell us what's your perspective. Thank you so very much, Dr. Zorefsky.
My pleasure.